Don Gaspar crossed borders, faced hunger, worked until exhaustion, all to build a decent future far from his homeland. But when he thought he could finally rest, fate took everything away without warning. Back in Mexico, without a home and without children around him, he had to start from scratch. But it was in the midst of loneliness, among empty streets and shattered dreams, that he found something no amount of money in the world could buy. Today, you'll learn a real story of sacrifice, abandonment, and a silent strength that not even the worst injustice could destroy. Get ready. This story will touch your heart. If you enjoy interesting stories, give us a like, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our content. And tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. We'd love to hear from you. Don Gaspar never thought his life would end up reduced to a few belongings, a rickety popsicle cart, and the persistent memory of everything he once was. Today, almost without strength, he walks through the dusty streets of Santa Rosalia, a forgotten town among the dry mountains of northern Mexico, pushing his old cart with the popsicles he prepares in the early mornings. His home, if it can be called that, is a borrowed room built of unplastered blocks with a metal sheet roof that creaks with every gust of wind. He lives thanks to the kindness of an old acquaintance who allowed him to stay there as long as God wills. There are no comforts, just a thin mattress on the floor, an old stove that barely lights, and a plastic box where he keeps his worn clothes. Every morning, before the sun even peeks over the hills, Don Gaspar gets up. He lights a candle because he doesn't even have electricity, and by the flickering light, he carefully arranges the popsicles in his cart. They're popsicles of modest flavors: strawberry, tamarind, mango, guava. He has no freezer. He uses dry ice that he buys on credit from a store in the central market. That small act of preparing his popsicles is, for him, a ritual of resistance, a silent demonstration that he's still not defeated. When he goes out to the street, the morning cold cuts to his bones. He wears an old jacket someone donated to him long ago. His steps are slow but firm. Each creak of the cart over the loose stones of the streets sounds like a reminder of his existence, a declaration that he's still fighting. "Popsicles! Fresh popsicles!" he shouts with a raspy voice he can barely raise. His call is lost among the alleyways, bouncing off the peeling facades and dying in the indifference of those who barely peek their heads out the window. Most already know him, but few stop. Some children, when they have loose change, run to him, joyfully asking for a popsicle. Sometimes they pay, sometimes they don't. Don Gaspar never says no. The main square of Santa Rosalia is his favorite place to sell. There, under the unforgiving midday sun, he sets up his cart next to a twisted tree that barely provides shade. He sits on a small concrete bench, watching people pass by. He sees couples arguing, old men playing cards, children chasing each other with laughter. He is there, invisible yet present at the same time, offering his merchandise and silently his story. His hands, hardened by decades of hard work, are witnesses to his life. Each scar, each callus tells a story. The years carrying bricks at construction sites, the long shifts in industrial kitchens, the winter nights where he worked cleaning closed restaurants. His face, lined with deep wrinkles, reflects a mixture of tiredness and unbreakable dignity. Sometimes, while waiting for customers, he closes his eyes for a moment and lets himself be carried away by memories. He sees himself young again, crossing the border, running through the desert with lungs about to burst, fearing every shadow. He remembers the first time he set foot on American soil, his amazement at seeing clean streets, supermarkets full of food, and at the same time, his sadness at having no one to share it with. Today, all of that seems to belong to another life, a life that remained there, on the other side of the wall. Here in Santa Rosalia, he only has his cart, his worn-out voice, and a stubborn faith that refuses to be extinguished. Every day is a battle. Sometimes he manages to sell a few popsicles, sometimes none. When sales are good, he treats himself to a small luxury, a Milanese sandwich at the market corner. When they're not, he dines on a couple of tortillas with salt. He never complains. For him, true failure would be giving up, and that Don Gaspar doesn't know how to do. The neighbors know him, but more than one whispers behind his back. Some think he must have done something to end up like this. Others simply prefer not to think about it. Few know his true story. Few understand that behind that old man with tired steps and a lost gaze, there's a man who once had dreams as big as the sky. When night falls and the last customer has gone, Don Gaspar returns to his little house. He pushes the cart uphill, sweating, panting. Upon arrival, he stores the leftover popsicles in a makeshift cooler and sits outside for a while, in an old plastic chair, looking at the stars. In those moments of infinite solitude, he sometimes speaks aloud, as if someone could hear him. He gives thanks for one more day, for still standing, for not having surrendered. Because Don Gaspar knows, deep in his heart, that although everything has been taken from him, as long as he preserves his dignity and his will to live, he will remain a complete man. And that neither misery nor forgetfulness can ever take away from him. So begins the story of Don Gaspar, the immigrant who lost everything, but who still walks each day with his head held high, carrying in his cart not only popsicles, but also the remains of a dream that refuses to die. Life in the United States was never as Don Gaspar had imagined when, as a young man, he heard stories of those who had made it in the North. As soon as he crossed the border, reality hit him with brutal force. Poorly paid jobs, endless workdays, rooms shared with strangers, and a loneliness that penetrated deeper than the cold of winter. His first job was in the fields, picking strawberries under a sun that burned the skin and left the body exhausted before midday. They paid him per full box, and the boxes seemed to multiply while his back was breaking in half. It didn't matter. Every dollar he earned was a promise of a better future. One more coin toward the dream of someday returning to his land, proud and victorious. Don Gaspar didn't speak English, but he quickly learned the language of short orders, rough gestures, and looks that reduced him to little more than a tool. "Work faster! Hurry up! No talking!" They were phrases that were etched into him like invisible scars. During the day, he worked without raising his head. At night, he slept in a makeshift room with 6 other men, in rickety beds that creaked at the slightest movement. The nostalgia for his family was an open wound. He missed the smell of his mother's cooking, the bustle of his siblings, the sound of rain hitting the roof of his house in Mexico. Each night before sleeping, he took out an old photo that he kept hidden in his wallet, a blurry image where his family appeared, gathered at a patron saint festival. He kissed the photo with devotion, murmured a prayer, and with his heart tight, closed his eyes. Over time, he found better jobs. He moved to Tucson, Arizona, where he found employment as a kitchen assistant in a Mexican restaurant. The pace was just as exhausting, but at least he was indoors, away from the sun and dust of the fields. He washed dishes, peeled vegetables, cleaned floors. He did it all without complaining, because every penny earned brought him closer to his dream. Little by little, he learned to cook. He observed the cooks, imitated their movements, memorized recipes. He didn't do it out of ambition, but out of survival. He knew that the more skills he had, the harder it would be to replace him. In those hot and noisy kitchens, where steam clouded the windows and the smell of spices permeated clothes, Don Gaspar began to discover an unexpected passion, the art of transforming simple ingredients into dishes that brought comfort to those who tasted them. Life was still hard, but Don Gaspar clung to small moments of joy, a well-prepared dish, an unexpected tip, a letter from Mexico. Every month, without fail, he sent money to his parents. It was never much, but it was enough for them to live with a little more dignity. The sacrifice was worth it, he repeated to himself every time fatigue threatened to knock him down. However, no matter how hard he tried, no matter how much he worked, Don Gaspar remained invisible to many. Deep down, he knew he was illegal, a ghost tolerated as long as he was useful, a man without rights, without a voice. Every time he saw an immigration patrol on the street, his heart raced. Every time he heard stories of raids on restaurants and factories, he felt fear freeze his blood. Even so, he never thought of going back. How could he, after so much effort, after so many years of absence? Going back empty-handed would be a defeat he wasn't willing to accept. So he kept going, gritting his teeth, enduring insults, discrimination, exploitation. All for the hope of one day, just one day, sitting in the square of his town and saying proudly, "I made it." But fate, always unpredictable, had prepared a blow harder than any of his workdays for him. One morning, while washing dishes in the restaurant where he had worked for 3 years, he heard a commotion at the entrance. He had no time to react. Immigration had arrived. They entered with warrants in hand, asking for papers that Don Gaspar didn't have. They handcuffed him in front of his co-workers, some of whom didn't even dare to look him in the eyes. He felt the cold of the metal on his wrists, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal after years of honest work. They didn't let him collect his things. They didn't give him time to call anyone. Within hours, he was on a bus headed for the border, escorted like a prisoner with a broken soul and a knot in his throat he couldn't undo. Everything he had fought for vanished from one day to the next. The house he planned to buy, the small savings in the bank, the plans to bring his parents to live with him. Everything was left behind, like an unfinished dream. He couldn't even say goodbye to the few friends he had made. He couldn't even write a last letter. As the bus drove down the highway, watching the arid landscape he had crossed so many times in his youth, Don Gaspar understood a bitter truth. In that country, he was never the master of his destiny. He was, and had always been, an unwanted visitor, someone who could be discarded at any moment without explanation or compassion. And now, alone, with his gaze fixed on the horizon and his heart in pieces, Don Gaspar prepared to return to a Mexico that was no longer his, to a land where the years of absence had erased his name from the memory of many. Returning to Mexico was harder than Don Gaspar had imagined. There were no embraces waiting for him on the other side. No welcome, no friends, not even a place of his own to fall into after that humiliating journey. He crossed the border on foot, with a small plastic bag in his hand that barely contained his belongings. A set of used clothes, a couple of folded photographs, and a cheap ring he had bought for his mother years ago that he never got to deliver. He spent the first night in a shelter in Tijuana, surrounded by other deportees who, like him, could barely stand. Nobody talked much. The tiredness, the shame, and the fear weighed too heavily to seek conversation. Don Gaspar sat in a corner, hugging his plastic bag, staring at nothing. He felt empty, disconnected from everything, as if he no longer belonged anywhere. With the few pesos they gave him at the deportation center, he took a bus heading south. He didn't know exactly where to go. He just wanted to get away from the border, from that constant reminder of his failure. So after almost 2 days of travel, he arrived in Santa Rosalia, a dusty town that seemed suspended in time, where adobe houses slowly crumbled under the weight of years, and the squares were empty. There, with his pride in pieces and his soul carrying years of unrecognized sacrifice, Don Gaspar tried to start again. He had nowhere to go. His childhood home, the one he had helped build with so much effort before leaving, no longer existed. In its place was a new, modern building, inhabited by people he didn't know. When asking about his family, he discovered that his parents had died years ago and that his siblings had migrated to other states, seeking better opportunities. No one was waiting for him. No one asked about him. It was an acquaintance from his youth, Don Lazaro, who, seeing him wandering the streets, recognized him and offered him an abandoned room at the back of his property. It wasn't much, a room with cracked walls, a roof that leaked when it rained, and an outdoor bathroom. But for Don Gaspar, it was more than he had. The first few days, he dedicated himself to cleaning the space. He swept mountains of dust, repaired some leaks with his own hands, improvised furniture with old wood. Each hammer blow, each nail he placed was his way of telling himself that he was still alive, that he could rebuild something even when everything seemed lost. Without official documents, without savings, without acquaintances who could help him, the only option he found to survive was to sell something simple, something that didn't require a large initial investment. He then remembered the fruit popsicles his mother made when he was a child, the ones she sold at the street market to supplement the family income. If he had previously learned to cook in Tucson kitchens, he could now prepare artisanal popsicles in his small refuge. With money borrowed from Don Lazaro, he bought a few bags of ice, plastic molds, seasonal fruit and sugar. He learned to prepare simple mixtures, mango, tamarind, strawberry with cream. He froze the popsicles in an improvised cooler using blocks of ice wrapped in jute sacks to keep them cold during the day. The first times he went out to sell were a baptism by fire. He pushed his cart along the cobblestone streets under the blazing sun, shouting his call with all his strength, "Popsicles, fresh little popsicles, get your nice cold popsicle." At first, few approached. Some looked at him with suspicion, others with simple indifference. He was a new face in a small town, and in places like that, distrust is stronger than need. But Don Gaspar didn't give up. With patience and humility, day after day, he earned people's trust. He haggled with housewives, gave popsicles to children who couldn't pay, greeted the old men who passed in the square with respect. Little by little, his cart became a familiar presence in Santa Rosalia. In the midst of this simple routine, Don Gaspar found unexpected solace: cooking. In the afternoons, when he returned after an exhausting day, he prepared his food with leftovers he got from the market. A little rice, some overripe vegetables, chicken bones given by the butcher. Cooking was for him more than a physical necessity. It was a ritual, a way to reconnect with something pure within himself. He would boil the ingredients while the golden light of evening entered through the cracks of his broken window. The steam from the pot filled the small room, impregnating it with aromas that awakened memories of his childhood, of his mother singing while stirring the atoll, of his father roasting corn in the yard. Each dish he prepared, however humble, was an act of resistance, a way of saying, "I'm still here." Although loneliness was his only companion, although the silence of the nights wrapped around him like a heavy cloak, Don Gaspar found in cooking a small sanctuary. It didn't matter if it was a stew of beans with hard tortillas or a watery rice soup. Each bite was an affirmation of his dignity, of his intact humanity. Sometimes, while eating in silence, he thought about everything he had left behind, the years lost in the north, the broken illusions, the invisible sacrifices. But he also thought about the small daily victories, a child smiling while savoring a popsicle, a woman thanking him for a kind gesture, an old man raising his hand in greeting. Those brief, almost imperceptible moments were now his true treasure. Don Gaspar understood that life doesn't always reward as one expects, that sometimes the only prize is being able to open your eyes each morning and having the courage to keep fighting, even when the world has forgotten about you. And in that silent struggle, in that stubborn persistence to live with decency despite everything, Don Gaspar found a strength that neither poverty, nor loneliness, nor forgetfulness could ever take away from him. When Don Gaspar closed his eyes during the brief moments of rest, it was inevitable that his mind would take him back to Tucson. There, in those hot and bustling kitchens, he had spent some of the hardest, but also the most formative years of his life. He remembered the huge woks that seemed to roar when the flames embraced them, the old pans that never stopped sizzling, and the sharp knives that danced in expert hands. At first, his task had simply been to wash dishes. Eternal workdays, where his hands became wrinkled and cracked from so much contact with hot water and corrosive soap. However, Gaspar was one of those who knew how to observe, who learned in silence. While rinsing trays and pots, he studied how the cooks chopped onions in seconds, how they mixed spices he had never tasted, how they organized everything in an almost perfect rhythm. One day, one of the main cooks, a man named Ramiro, of Salvadoran origin, injured his wrist and couldn't come to work. The owner, desperate not to stop service, asked if anyone else knew how to cook, even just the basics. None of the assistant cooks wanted to risk their position, but Don Gaspar, without thinking twice, raised his hand. The first time he stood in front of a professional pan, his nerves threatened to betray him. The oil was smoking, orders were piling up in the window, and the boss was shouting orders in broken English. But Don Gaspar took a deep breath, remembered every movement he had observed for months, and, with a steady hand, began to prepare the dishes. That night, although he made mistakes, he got through it. No one went without dinner, and the owner, impressed by his speed and humility, offered him a place in the kitchen, this time no longer as a dishwasher, but as a line assistant. From that moment, his life changed. He worked alongside cooks of different nationalities, Mexicans, Salvadorans, Guatemalans, Cubans. Each taught him something. He learned to prepare mole, pozole, pupusas, rice and beans, ceviches, Tex-Mex-style fajitas. Each dish was a new story, a technique that was added to his silent repertoire. Don Gaspar didn't just cook, he understood the soul of cooking. He knew when the rice was just right just by the smell, when the meat was perfectly seared just by the sound it made on the grill. He became a man of trust in the restaurant. He wasn't the best paid, nor the most recognized, but he was indispensable. And in that world, where everything was fleeting, being necessary was a way of belonging. The best memories he kept were of the early mornings after closing, when the kitchen was silent, lit only by the emergency lights. He would sit in a corner with a plate of whatever was left over, sometimes a chicken stew, sometimes a thick soup. He ate slowly, savoring not only the food, but also the feeling of having survived another day. It was in those moments of quiet solitude that he allowed himself to dream. He imagined one day opening his own food stand, maybe a small restaurant where he could offer dishes from his homeland, where no one would look at him like an intruder. He saw himself serving tamales, soups, freshly made tacos. He imagined greeting customers, laughing with children, being part of a community. Those dreams, though simple, were his fuel. Every burn he got in the kitchen, every cut on his fingers, every sleepless dawn was worth it if in the end he could achieve that dream. But there was a hidden sadness that never left him. His family. While he cooked for strangers, his parents were aging without him. His siblings were forming families he barely knew. His roots were unraveling in his absence. Guilt was a constant weight in his chest. Every time he sent money home, he felt a mixture of relief and pain. He knew he was helping, but he also knew that nothing could give him back the hugs, the laughter, and the moments he was missing. He never went to ask anyone for help. He didn't resort to consulates or immigrant organizations. He firmly believed that everyone had to earn their place, that his value as a man depended on his ability to support himself. That stubbornness, which had allowed him to survive for so long, was also what left him alone when he needed support the most. Now, in his small room in Santa Rosalia, remembering all of that while stirring a simple stew in a borrowed pot, Don Gaspar understood that those years in Tucson had been his true learning. He hadn't just learned to cook, he had learned to resist, to adapt, to find beauty in simplicity. And although all of that now seemed so distant, so unreal, he knew that no one could take that knowledge away from him. Neither the deportation, nor the abandonment, nor the current poverty could erase the lessons tattooed on his skin. Work hard, be loyal, stay humble, and never lose hope, even when the world seemed to have forgotten his existence. It was that, precisely, that kept a small spark burning in his chest every time he pushed his popsicle cart. The memory that, in another time and in another place, he had managed to survive against all odds, and if he had done it once, he could do it again. Though the road was long, though the hill was steep, Don Gaspar knew he still had the strength to move forward. Don Gaspar's deportation wasn't just a legal process. It was an open wound that never fully healed. He remembered every detail as if it had happened just yesterday. The metallic sound of the handcuffs, the furtive glances of colleagues who avoided making eye contact with him, the feeling of being invisible to those who didn't want complications. That morning, while scrubbing pots in the restaurant kitchen, he never imagined it would be his last day in the United States. There was no fair trial, no opportunity to explain his story. His years of work, his entire life built brick by brick. Within hours, he found himself in the back of an official van, along with other men who shared the same empty look of hopelessness. One of them sobbed silently, another prayed softly. Don Gaspar just gritted his teeth, looking out the window at the world that was blurring behind him. As the bus advanced toward the border, he felt that each kilometer tore a piece of his soul away. He had worked more than 20 years in that country. He had broken his back, had lived in tiny rooms, had endured freezing winters and summers that melted the asphalt, all to build a dream that now evaporated without mercy. In his mind, he went over the same questions again and again. What will I do now? Where will I start? Who cares about me? The answer, deep in his chest, was an overwhelming silence. The arrival in Mexico was an even harder blow. The Mexican immigration officers barely offered them a bottle of water and a sheet with addresses of shelters. Don Gaspar looked at them without saying a word. He took the paper, crumpled it in his hand, and walked out aimlessly. He was like a ghost, a man whom the world had erased without leaving a trace. With the little money he had saved in his socks, his last resort, he took a bus south, looking to get as far away from the border as possible. The journey was endless. He couldn't sleep. Each stop, each checkpoint, was a reminder of his new condition, a deportee, a man without land, without belongings, without a clear future. When he finally arrived in Santa Rosalia, he discovered that time had not waited for him. The town had changed. The streets he remembered full of children playing were now empty and dusty. The houses he once knew were inhabited by unfamiliar faces. His own family seemed to have vanished into the wind. No one was waiting for him. No one welcomed him. He tried to communicate with his children, born on American soil. He had sent them money all his life, had worked tirelessly to give them opportunities he never had. But the messages he sent went unanswered. The calls were ignored. Sometimes he received dry, indifferent responses. "We're busy. We'll talk later." That indifference hurt more than any deportation. He understood that time and distance changed people, but he never thought he would be forgotten so quickly, as if his existence had become an uncomfortable burden for those for whom he had sacrificed everything. The height of his misfortune came when, seeking refuge in the house he had helped build before emigrating, he discovered that it no longer belonged to him. The property had been sold by one of his brothers, in urgent need of money, without anyone consulting him. Now, in its place, stood a modern home, with a metal gate and security cameras watching over the threshold that was once his. Don Gaspar stood in front of the house, looking at the closed gate, feeling that a part of himself remained trapped on the other side, forever. He didn't knock. He didn't ask. He knew there was no going back. With a broken heart, carrying just a backpack with his few belongings, he walked aimlessly until his steps led him to an abandoned park. He sat on a rusty bench, watching the sunset paint the distant hills red. For the first time in a long time, he allowed tears to flow freely down his weathered face. He had no shame. There was no one to see him. Just him, his pain, and an immense sky that seemed to make him even smaller. But in the midst of that inner devastation, something inside Don Gaspar refused to fall completely. Perhaps it was the habit of resisting. Perhaps it was the memory of his mother teaching him as a child not to give up. Or perhaps it was simply the survival instinct that had shaped every fiber of his being during all those years in the north. The next morning, he got up from that bench as best he could. He shook the dust from his pants, adjusted his cap over his graying hair, and promised himself that, even if it was in the most absolute poverty, he would find a way to start again. Life had taken almost everything from him. His youth, his dreams, his family, but there was something that not even adversity could take away from him: his dignity. And with that, Don Gaspar knew he still had something to offer the world, even if the world had forgotten about him. If you're enjoying this story, give it a like, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications to stay up to date with all our content. Don Gaspar thought he had known loneliness during his years in the United States, but it was upon returning to Mexico that he understood what it truly meant to be alone. In Santa Rosalia, he walked among faces that didn't recognize him, streets that no longer belonged to him, and memories that seemed to fade as soon as he tried to reach them. Each step he took, each corner he turned, was like walking through a strange place, even though it was his homeland. The absence of his home was only the first blow. Little by little, reality finished collapsing on him when he tried to find his children. At first, he wrote them brief messages, full of tenderness, asking how they were, sending them blessings and words of love. The minutes turned into hours in front of the screen of a borrowed cell phone, waiting for a response that didn't come. When one finally responded, they did it with short, dry phrases, almost out of obligation. "I'm fine. I'm busy. I'll call you later." Don Gaspar tried not to take it badly. He thought that perhaps their lives were hectic, that work, studies, or the worries of daily life prevented them from paying attention to him. But deep inside, he knew the truth. The distance hadn't just been physical, it had been emotional. He had sacrificed everything to give them a better future, and now that time had turned them into adults, it seemed that his father figure was just an uncomfortable shadow of the past. At times, sitting on the edge of his makeshift bed, he would read and reread those brief messages, looking for some trace of affection in them, some spark of connection. He found nothing. The wound was deep, a pain that wasn't expressed in tears, but in that permanent emptiness that settled in his chest like a black hole devouring any attempt at hope. When trying to approach old childhood friends, he encountered more indifference. Many of them had aged, others had died, or simply moved away in search of a better life. The few acquaintances who remained looked at him like a stranger. They knew about his time in the United States, but no one asked much. In a small town, the success or failure of a man is measured by what he has: properties, cars, businesses. Don Gaspar had none of these, and in a world where a person's worth is calculated by their material wealth, his poverty was a stigma. Sometimes, while pushing his popsicle cart under the merciless midday sun, he would pass by the houses where he once played as a child. Now, those houses were inhabited by families who didn't know who he was. Each laugh of other people's children, each song that came out of an open window, was a painful echo of what he had lost. On more than one occasion, some curious customer dared to ask him why he had returned. Don Gaspar would smile, shrug his shoulders, and respond with a simple, "It was God's will." But deep down, each swallowed word, each untold story, was a burden that was silently wearing him down. The greatest test of his new reality came one Sunday afternoon. That day, after selling some popsicles in the square, he decided to pass by the town church. the same one where he was baptized, where his mother used to take him as a child. Upon entering, he found a service half begun, full of unfamiliar faces. He sat in one of the last pews, lowered his head, and closed his eyes. He didn't pray. He didn't ask for anything. He was just there, as if searching among the cracked walls and dusty stained glass for some trace of who he used to be. When the Mass ended, he waited for everyone to leave. He approached the altar, lit a candle, and for the first time in a long time, allowed his heart to speak. He didn't ask for riches. He didn't ask for revenge. He just whispered a word that came from the depths of his being: strength. He knew that if anything remained, it was that: the capacity to resist. Life had taken everything else from him: family, belongings, future. But as long as he had strength, even if it was just a breath, he would keep fighting. That night, as he returned to his borrowed little house, the fresh desert air caressed his face. The stars twinkled above his head, indifferent to his sorrows. And Don Gaspar, with each step, with each heartbeat, silently reaffirmed his promise not to let himself be defeated. Loneliness was his new companion, the indifference of the world, his new reality. But his dignity, that which neither the years nor the borders nor the forgetfulness could break, remained intact. And as long as that spark lived within him, Don Gaspar would continue to find reasons to get up each morning, load his popsicle cart, and give smiles to children who knew nothing of his story, but who, without knowing it, gave him a reason to keep going. There were things in life that neither time nor pain could erase. In Don Gaspar's heart, despite all the suffering, an indestructible and profound love still beat: the love for his mother. Doña Pascuala had been his refuge, his first home, the voice that taught him to fight, the embrace that always lifted him, even when life seemed to crush him. It was she who, many years ago, had given him her blessing before he left for the north. He could still hear her voice in his memory: "Go, son, make your life, but don't forget where you come from." During the years in the United States, Don Gaspar sent money every month, making sure his mother never lacked anything. No matter how scarce his pay was, he always set aside a few dollars for her. It was his way of thanking, of paying a debt of love impossible to repay. But time, silent and cruel, does not forgive. One morning, while organizing his popsicles in the small cooler of his cart, he received an unexpected call. It was his cousin Ernesto, one of the few relatives who still spoke to him. With a broken voice, he told him that Doña Pascuala was sick, very sick, and that she was asking for him. Don Gaspar didn't hesitate for a second. He left the cart stored away, collected his few belongings, and with his heart in his throat, borrowed money for the fare. He knew he had no time to lose. Every second was vital. The journey was long. He traversed kilometers of desolate highways, crossed ghost towns where the wind seemed to sing sad songs, passed through empty bus stations where no one smiled. Throughout the journey, Don Gaspar fought against the fear of not arriving in time. He closed his eyes, gritted his teeth, and whispered over and over, "Wait for me, Mom. Please, wait for me." When he finally arrived at the small hospital in Commandu, his heart was beating so hard he feared his chest would break. He ran through the grey hallways, dodging nurses and stretchers, until he found the room where his mother was hospitalized. Upon entering, he saw her. Small, fragile, with the palest skin he remembered, but with eyes still shining with love. Doña Pascuala smiled weakly when she saw him. It was a smile that contained a lifetime of waiting, of longing, of blessings murmured on lonely nights. Don Gaspar approached, fell to his knees beside her bed, and took her trembling hand in his. He couldn't say anything. He just cried, letting all the unspoken words slide in the form of tears. "You're here now, my son," she whispered, caressing his face. "Now I can rest." They stayed like that for a long time in silence, communicating without the need for words. Don Gaspar told her about his life in the north, his battles, his falls, his small triumphs. He promised her that despite everything, he would keep going. He thanked her for her unconditional love, for her unshakable faith. Doña Pascuala, though weak, listened attentively, squeezing his hand as if wanting to engrave his presence in her memory forever. From time to time, she would close her eyes, breathing with difficulty, but would open them again, clinging to those last moments together. When the sun began to set, tinting the room with a melancholic orange, Doña Pascuala raised a hand with effort and touched her son's chest. "Don't cry for me, little Gaspar," she said with a barely audible voice. "I will always be here." And she gently tapped his chest. "In your heart." Don Gaspar nodded, unable to speak. He could only kiss her hand again and again, as if asking forgiveness for the lost years, for the absences, for the calls not made. That night, while the town slept, Doña Pascuala passed away, silently, without pain, like someone simply crossing from one room to another. Don Gaspar didn't scream. He didn't tear himself apart with pain. He simply stayed there, sitting next to her, holding her hand, accompanying her to the end. He cried in silence, with dignity, as he had done all his life. The funeral was simple. A couple of neighbors, some distant relatives, and Don Gaspar standing by the coffin, remembering the promise his mother had extracted from him in life, to be strong, to keep walking, never to give up. When the earth fell on the coffin, Don Gaspar felt that a part of himself was buried as well. But deep down, he knew that something of her would live forever within him. Her strength, her faith, her unconditional love. He returned to Santa Rosalia with a new sadness, heavier but also more serene. He knew that loneliness would be even greater now, but he also knew he wasn't truly alone. Each step he took, each popsicle he sold, each child who smiled upon receiving his product, was a way to honor Doña Pascuala's life. And so, between sadness and resilience, Don Gaspar found one more reason to keep going. Not for himself, but for her, for the love that not even death could destroy. A few months had passed since Don Gaspar buried his mother. Life in Santa Rosalia had returned to its monotonous rhythm, mornings loaded with unforgiving sun, silent afternoons, and nights where the only noise was the creak of the wind hitting the dry trees. Despite the sadness that accompanied him like a shadow, Don Gaspar didn't stop getting up every morning to prepare his popsicles. It was as if each day, each sale, each smile given was his silent way of honoring Doña Pascuala's memory. The kitchen remained his refuge, with ingredients he got at low cost or, sometimes, that were given to him at the market. Don Gaspar prepared small meals that not only fed his body, but gave meaning to his existence. Each simple stew, each improvised dish, was a form of resistance, of reminding himself that he could still be useful, that he could still take care of himself. On one of those afternoons when the heat was almost unbearable, sitting on a stone in front of his house while slowly chewing a bean taco, Don Gaspar allowed himself to think about everything he had learned during his life. They weren't things one could read in books. They were lessons carved by blows, the importance of patience, the value of humility, the need to be grateful even in poverty. He watched the children running barefoot in the streets and couldn't help but remember his own youthful dreams, when he thought the world was full of opportunities waiting to be conquered. Now he understood that for many, those opportunities never came. That life, for most, was resisting and moving forward day after day, without promises or certainties. In his heart, there was a special place reserved for those years working in the United States. Despite the pain and injustice, he knew his effort hadn't been in vain. He hadn't accumulated wealth, hadn't bought houses or cars, but he had achieved something that for him was worth much more. Helping his parents live with dignity, paying for his children's basic education, sending medicines, food, clothes. Those were his true conquests. He knew the world measured success in material possessions, but for Don Gaspar, true success was having loved without expecting anything in return. And although his children now barely spoke to him, although time and distance had erased the bonds that once united them, he remained proud of having done the right thing. One afternoon, while fixing his popsicle cart, a neighbor approached to chat. It was Don Margarito, an older man who had also been a migrant in his youth. They sat under the scant shade of a mesquite tree, sharing a warm, soft drink and old stories. "And what did we get, Gaspar?" asked Don Margarito with a sad smile. "What did we get from so many years there?" Don Gaspar remained silent for a few seconds, looking at the horizon where the desert seemed to melt under the sun. "We learned that we are strong, Margarito. Stronger than we thought," he finally replied with a firm voice. That brief conversation left a mark on his spirit. He understood that many of those who, like him, had ventured north, returned empty of goods, but full of scars that made them wiser, more compassionate. Although sometimes the world didn't want to see it, they were true warriors. It was also in those days when Don Gaspar began to reflect on something that had troubled him for years: the competition and envy among migrants themselves. He remembered how, in the United States, some compatriots rejoiced more at the fall of a countryman than at his success. He remembered looks full of jealousy when someone achieved a better position, hurtful comments disguised as jokes, silent betrayals born of desperation and fear. That memory hurt him. In his vision of the world, Latinos, migrants, should be a big family, supporting each other, sharing the weight of nostalgia, celebrating together each small achievement. He dreamed of a world where a Mexican would not see in another Mexican a rival, but a brother. Don Gaspar wasn't a man of speeches or grand words, but his life, his daily example of humility, hard work, and respect, was his way of preaching those values he so longed to see in others. Some nights, while arranging his things after selling his popsicles, he wrote small thoughts in an old notebook he had found in the trash, simple phrases, born from his tired heart, but still full of faith. Supporting each other is stronger than competing. One who helps doesn't lose, but grows. Hard roads are less heavy if walked together. He wrote without expecting anyone to read these notes. They were for him to not forget who he was, to remember that even in a world where indifference was the currency, there was room for kindness and solidarity. With each word he put in that notebook, Don Gaspar reaffirmed himself as a man of principles, a man who, despite poverty, loneliness, and abandonment, continued to believe in humanity. Each popsicle he sold, each greeting he offered, each smile he drew from a child or an old man was an act of resistance, an act of love. And as his cart creaked when rolling through the dusty streets, Don Gaspar carried with him something much more valuable than any material fortune: the certainty that he had lived with honor, with honesty, with unconditional love. A wealth that neither time, nor distance, nor injustice could ever take away from him. Don Gaspar's life, although simple and solitary, was full of small acts of kindness that very few came to notice. He was one of those men who gave without expecting anything in return, who helped in silence, like someone planting seeds in an arid field, trusting that someday something would bloom. One afternoon, while following his usual route selling popsicles, he found a small puppy curled up under a bench in the square. The puppy, skinny to the bone, was trembling from cold, with a sad and lost look. He had an injured paw and fur tangled with dust. No one seemed to see him. Some children played nearby, but didn't approach the animal. Adults passed by, too busy with their own problems. Don Gaspar stopped in front of the puppy. He bent down slowly, as if fearing to scare him, and extended his hand. "What happened, little one? Who left you here all alone?" He spoke with that tenderness that only comes from hearts that have known abandonment. The dog, after a few seconds of doubt, crawled toward him and rested his head on his hand. It was as if he understood that this man with tired steps and weathered face would do him no harm. Without thinking twice, Don Gaspar wrapped the puppy in his old jacket and carried him to his house. He didn't have much to offer: a little water in a rusty can, leftover rice and tortillas from the day before. But what he gave from the heart. He called him Benito, a simple name like his new life. Benito became his inseparable companion. Every morning, when Don Gaspar went out to sell his popsicles, the puppy trotted beside him, wagging his tail enthusiastically. Even though his legs still limped slightly, Benito didn't leave his side. It was as if he had found in Don Gaspar not just an owner, but a kindred spirit, someone who, like him, had been cast aside by the world. Benito's presence filled Don Gaspar's humble home with life. He no longer ate in complete silence. Now there were 2 plates on the table, one for him and another for his new friend. When he sat in his plastic chair to watch the sunset, Benito curled up at his feet, sharing that silence loaded with memories and broken dreams. Sometimes, while walking together through the dusty streets, Don Gaspar would find himself smiling, a small, sincere smile, born from the simple fact of having someone who waited for him, who followed him, who loved him unconditionally. Those long days of selling also changed. Children, seeing Benito, would run to pet him and, in the process, buy popsicles. Some adults, seeing the old popsicle vendor with his skinny dog, would be motivated to buy from him, if only out of compassion. And although Don Gaspar didn't seek pity, he appreciated each sale, each kind word, each gesture of humanity. Benito, without knowing it, had given him back something he thought was lost: the feeling of belonging to something, of mattering to someone. One Sunday, after a good day of sales, Don Gaspar allowed himself a small luxury. He bought half a kilo of beef at the market. It wasn't something he could afford often, but that afternoon, he wanted to celebrate. He prepared a simple stew, like the ones he learned to cook in Tucson kitchens, and shared the feast with Benito, who looked at him with bright eyes, grateful beyond words. As they dined under the starry sky, Don Gaspar raised his glass of water as if making a toast. "To you, Benito, because even if the world forgets about us, we don't forget how to love," he said with a hoarse voice but loaded with emotion. That night, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: a deep peace. Of course, not everything was easy. He still faced the harshness of poverty, the indifference of many, the silent pain of not receiving news from his children. But now, he wasn't completely alone. He had Benito, his little battle companion, his silent witness. And every time fatigue or sadness threatened to defeat him, he remembered that his life, however humble, was full of dignity. In one of his walks, Don Gaspar found an abandoned piece of wood and, with the help of some rusty nails and borrowed tools, built a more comfortable cart for his business. He hand-painted a sign that read, "Don Gaspar and Benito's Popsicles," with drawings of colorful popsicles and a smiling puppy. The first time he went out with his new cart, he felt that, somehow, he was starting again. It wasn't the own restaurant he had dreamed of in his youth. It wasn't the life of comfort he had imagined. But it was his. It was the fruit of his effort. It was his small victory against forgetfulness and abandonment. Each child who laughed at seeing the cart, each old man who asked how his assistant Benito was doing, was a reminder that success isn't always measured in riches, but in the mark one leaves on the hearts of others. And Don Gaspar, without knowing it, had begun to leave an indelible mark on that town that little by little was starting to see him not as a stranger, but as part of its own history. A story of resistance, of humility, of love. A story that had not yet ended. Days in Santa Rosalia continued their course, slow but steady, like the waves that hit distant shores without asking permission. Don Gaspar and Benito had become a usual sight in the town. the old popsicle vendor, with tired eyes but a sincere smile, and his faithful four-legged companion, always trotting by his side. Life was still hard. Sales were sometimes good. Other times they barely reached enough to buy a couple of tortillas and beans. But Don Gaspar had learned to find joy in small details. A cloudy afternoon that relieved the scorching heat, an unexpected tip from a lost tourist, a sincere laugh from children seeing Benito chasing his own tail. On one of those days of slow sales, while resting in the main square, a young, well-dressed man approached the cart. He was a journalist from a small local portal, and curious about the endearing image of the old popsicle vendor and his dog, asked Don Gaspar to tell his story. Don Gaspar at first hesitated. He wasn't a man to talk much about himself. His life he carried in his heart, not in words. But something in the respectful way the young man asked, in his sincere interest, made him open up little by little. Sitting on a bench under a dusty tree, Don Gaspar recounted, without embellishments or dramatics, the fragments of his life: crossing the border, years of hard work, deportation, loneliness, the reunion with his mother, the sadness of children who no longer answered, the love for Benito, the popsicle cart that was now his livelihood and his pride. The journalist listened attentively, taking notes, recording some phrases. Before saying goodbye, he promised to tell his story with the respect it deserved. A week later, the portal published an article titled, "Don Gaspar, the immigrant who lost everything, but not his dignity." The story went viral. People from other towns, even from other cities, read about Don Gaspar. Some were moved, others saw themselves reflected in his silent struggle. Curious visitors began to arrive in Santa Rosalia, who, after knowing the story, not only bought a popsicle, but took the time to greet him, to listen to him, to thank him for his example of life. A local businessman, moved by the report, donated a new cart to him, bright, with a shiny little bell and enough space to keep the popsicles fresher. Other neighbors, who before barely spoke to him, offered to help. One gave him an awning to protect him from the sun, another gave him a small portable fan. Don Gaspar accepted each gift with humility, without fanfare, always thanking with a hand on his heart. But what moved him most weren't the material gifts. It was seeing that his story, his life, hadn't been in vain. That someone somewhere had found strength, comfort, or hope in knowing him. It wasn't fame he sought. He didn't even seek recognition. His true reward was knowing that despite all the wounds, he remained a living example that dignity is not lost in poverty or in forgetfulness. With the improved income thanks to sales and some anonymous donations, Don Gaspar was able to improve his little house a bit. He bought a decent mattress to rest his tired bones, fixed the sheet metal roof so it wouldn't leak every time it rained, and was even able to install a small new stove to better cook his food. And of course, he didn't forget Benito. He bought him a dog bed, one of those padded ones he once saw in the market and thought he could never afford. The day Benito laid down for the first time in his new bed, looking at his master with those eyes full of devotion, Don Gaspar felt a pure, childlike happiness, one of those that cannot be explained in words. One afternoon, as they walked together toward the square, Don Gaspar stopped to contemplate the horizon. The sun was setting slowly, painting the sky in orange and pink tones. Benito, as always, was curiously sniffing everything in his path. The old popsicle vendor closed his eyes for a few seconds, breathing deeply. He had suffered. He had cried. He had been betrayed by those he loved most. But he had also resisted. He had found new reasons to smile. He had proved that the value of a man is not measured by what he possesses, but by the strength of his spirit to keep walking, even when everything seems lost. Children ran toward him as soon as they heard the little bell of his new cart. "Don Gaspar! Don Gaspar! Give me a mango one!" they shouted between laughs. And he, smiling with that mixture of tiredness and tenderness that only the wise possess, began to hand out popsicles one after another, while Benito, sitting to one side, wagged his tail happily. That day, as the sun set and the cool breeze began to roam the streets of Santa Rosalia, Don Gaspar understood something that perhaps he always knew in the deepest part of his soul. It doesn't matter how much life takes from you. As long as you have love to give, dignity to sustain you, and faith to keep walking, you will never be truly defeated. And so, among laughing children, barking dogs, and colorful popsicles shining under the sky of a forgotten Mexico, Don Gaspar continued forward, firm, dignified, invincible. If you liked this story, you'll surely love the next one appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and turn on notifications. Until next time.